we were talking about the Mountain of Assembly a couple weeks ago, and so it ended up being pretty dense. It was a lot of information. Tonight, I try to break it down, kind of like keep it, keep it a little bit shorter. It's not that short though. But we're on the overall theme again about heaven and earth. And so this is a little bit of a side trip, I guess you could say, but you'll see more and more how it relates to the overall theme of heaven and earth. And this mountain of assembly. It's in Hebrew, it's Har Moed and or Moged, if you're putting in the kind of like glottal sound, I guess. And it's a term that is sprinkled throughout the Old Testament, and it's also in Greek in the New Testament, and it's not a thing that we often talk about, I think. But this right here is a depiction, of course, of Jesus giving his Sermon on the Mount, which is a mountain of assembly scene. He kind of, I think, on purpose, sets it up that way and addresses the people who have come out to see him as the mountain of assembly. We'll cover that in a little while. But just to kind of recap our theme about heaven and earth, of course, that heaven is God's space and earth is our space, but that heaven and earth were meant to overlap and intertwine. It's not supposed to be completely separate. And what man was made for is for the express purpose of standing at the threshold between the two, at the threshold of both, as priests and kings, being earth's representatives to heaven as priests and being God's representatives or his image here on earth. But of course, the rebellion of man caused the rift between our space and his space. And because of this, the earth is under a curse because of our rebellion. But the gospel, of course, is and because of what Christ did, the redemption of man and the redemption of earth go hand in hand. So we talked about, the resurrection, but also the idea of the new earth, and that that God is not going to just abandon either one. That earth will be redeemed, and since we were made to rule God's earth, that will have to be redeemed as well. So Christ's works means the resurrection of the body and the redemption of earth. And of course, we talked about the kinsman redeemer idea several weeks ago as well. So with this mountaintop thing, of course, your attention may be going straight to the idea of the mountain, but the assembly part of it is something that then the reason I wasn't just going to call it the mountain of God or the mountains in the Bible or something like that is because it is paired with the idea that there is an assembly there. That another word for assembly, of course, is the church. Another word for that is ecclesia or the council. There's an idea of the divine council, and we see the divine council subject throughout Scripture. In Job, you see it because of that meeting between the angels and God, and they show up in his throne room, and Satan's there too, and that's where you have the conversation about Job and what should be done about him, or the challenge that Satan gives God about that. And then Second Kings, you see a vision that a prophet has where he sees a heavenly council meeting, and all these spirits are one spirit saying this, another spirit saying that, until one spirit steps forward and says, "I'll be a lying I'll be a lying mouth in the mouths of the prophets, and I will deceive King Ahab, and it'll be his demise." And God's like, "Okay, we'll go with that." Of course, God goes with the final decision. We also saw examples, even in Daniel, in the last study that we did in Daniel 4, that King Nebuchadnezzar had been so full of pride and of himself that there was a decree made that he should be exiled from his kingdom for a length of time, and that he would live as an animal and lose his mind. But that was a decision made by the Heavenly Council. They were called the Watchers in that case. So whenever you have this, the Divine Council, now there are humans that are involved in this. So sometimes these meetings involve humans, and most specifically prophets. In other words, one of the definitions of a prophet is that somebody who stood in the council of the gods, or in the council of God. And so when it does involve a prophet, the setting, you see these settings, and they can be in a number of places. It doesn't matter that much geographically, because you see this idea of a mobile throne, like in Ezekiel's vision. He is in Babylon when he has that vision. But sometimes you see it on the mountaintop, and that's a common thing, where you have a heavenly council meeting on the mountaintop. Moses on Sinai is a heavenly council meeting up on the mountains. And later in the New Testament, it's taken for granted that the law was delivered by angels. So we know that angels were there and that they were delivering the law to Moses. And then, of course, Moses was commissioned to not only bring the law, but to construct a temple, a tent, I should say, a tabernacle that was patterned on the things that he saw up there. So you can assume that there was a tent of meeting or something like that. And those are, and that's another thing that we see in the scripture there a couple times is the tent of meeting, or a tent of assembly. So sometimes it was on a mountaintop, such as the case with Sinai. And when that was the case, the mountain would become the mountain of God. It doesn't matter if it had a history of being a demonic pagan high place or not. God would say, oh, well, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to have a meeting, and it doesn't matter what small g God is, or if it's Baal or whoever else thinks that they rule this mountain, this is where I'm going to have my meeting, and he would just kind of take over the mountain. That is another theme that you're going to see in some of the scriptures we'll cover today, where it's, like you had a, demonic high place type of mountain, mythology surrounding that, and then God would just kind of show up there. Same thing with Mount Carmel, like when you saw Elijah and the showdown of Baal on Mount Carmel. It's you think that Baal is the rain god. Well, I'm going to pray for there not to be any rain, and then I'm going to pray for there to be rain. And God is the one who is doing this, and Baal can't really do anything about it either way. So it's it's always in the Bible is always in these conversations and comparisons and contrasts with the pagan beliefs. So let's talk a little bit about these pagan high places. The typical scenario would be that, the understanding would be that there was a most high God, maybe at one point, or that there still is, but he becomes kind of like they fade into the distance in a lot of these mythologies. And because it was one of his sons, or the second, like in the second God overturns his father or something like that. It's we call these succession myths. I always kind of thought it was interesting because all of the action seems to be with the secondary gods, and what does that imply, and what does that tell you? And now that this new God had ruled from the mountaintop instead of his father or whatever, and he's got his own assembly of the gods. He rules in the assemblies of gods. They lived on mountaintop paradise gardens, a lot of times in tents. They created humans, or humans were created by accident because somebody, like one of the gods got cut and bled or something like that, goes to the earth and humans pop out of it and whatever. But humans are kind of treated as slaves and to provide for the gods' needs. Some of the humans, in other words, kings, in a sense, were allowed in their ruling space. So they're not, they are allowed in the assembly, so to speak. But it's to represent that god or those gods. So kings were often conflated with gods, or they were called the image of the god or the image of the gods. Kings were referred to, they were thought of as the embodiment of the gods. So kind of the same way that an idol was thought to be an embodiment of the god. Like Pharaoh. Pharaoh was thought to be an embodiment of the gods, or the god, but that's usually the way that people thought of kings and the way that kings thought of themselves. So they would build their own paradises and palaces and stuff like that, and it would be kind of like a recreation of what they thought was up there in the mountains. And if you didn't have a mountain nearby, or if you just wanted to, you could build your own high place, like the pyramids were high places, or you could build a ziggurat, such as the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. They were temple. You make a temple on top of your own mountain. So let's start with some of these mountains. First of all, Mount Zaphon. Zaphon literally means north in Hebrew. So sometimes it's a little bit difficult to tell if the scripture is talking about the north or if it's talking about the Mount Zaphon. It is also the name of a city in Gad, which is mentioned in Judges and in Joshua. But whenever we're talking about Mount Zaphon, that was north of Israel. It was the cosmic mountain of Baal in Canaanite literature. So that's where they believe Baal ruled from and had his assembly. So his father was the chief god El, and I think he castrates his father El or something like that. And there's all this. El is kind of shown to be like weak, and he fades into the background. It becomes all about Baal, and he's the one who rises to leadership. Interestingly, he kind of rules from the mountaintop, but at the same time, he defeats, like some of the underworld figures, and then he sets up a palace in the underworld. So Baal is both associated with the mountaintop, but he's also associated with the underworld. In Isaiah 14, Isaiah is writing to the king of Babylon, and a lot of people see this scripture as being kind of like a double. It's a double meaning, so that he's addressing the king of Babylon, but he's also addressing the spirit behind the king of Babylon. And it says, "How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn! You have been cut down to the earth. You have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on throne on the mountain of assembly, on the utmost heights of Zaphon." So there's that, image of, the Baal's mountain. "I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit." So here is somebody or some entity who thinks that they are going to ascend above the stars of God, or above the other, the angels of God, and that he's going to sit on the mountain of the assembly. Remember this term right here, Har Moed, or Har Moged. This apostrophe here stands for a letter called the Ayim, and it is a letter that now in modern Hebrew we don't pronounce, so it'd be Har Moed. In the olden times, they would say it with like a kind of what would sound like to us like a G, like a G sound, right? Har Moged. And it's kind of like where Gomorrah comes from. If you look at the modern Hebrew, it's not Gomorrah, it's Omorah. right? It's just not even pronounced. But we call it Gomorrah because it did have a ayim at the beginning of it. It's the same sound. So that's where it's my opinion and some scholars' opinion that, like, when we're talking about the Armageddon, that's what we're talking about. It's the mountain of assembly. You know, it's the battle of the mountain of God, which makes a lot of sense in the biblical narrative. You know, and it sounds like, you know, it's Armageddon sounds more that like Armageddon than Megiddo to me, just looking at it from the outside. I'm no expert in those languages, but with but I am seeing more and more of the mountain of assembly idea throughout Scripture, and to me it just makes sense. Psalm 48. It's a psalm of the Korahites, a song. Great is the Lord and highly praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Fairest of heights, the joy of all the earth, Mount Zion, the heights of Zaphon, the city of the great king. So it's again, you know, Zaphon is Baal's mountain, but it doesn't matter. It's like God sets up his mountain wherever. There's always like this taunting and calling out of these Baal mountains or these pagan mountains. Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon's the other big one. It means literally the sacred mountain, Mount Hermon. It's the highest mountain in ancient Israel, and it is at the northmost region of Israel. It's in Caesarea Philippi, basically that region. It is where, if you've ever read the book of First Enoch, that's where the sons of God, or the Watchers, as they're called in Enoch, staged their plans to have children with human women. They came down from heaven, basically landed on Mount Hermon, and then started their shenanigans from there. But that was their version of their Mount of Assembly. And it kind of matches a bit of like the mythology around Mount Hermon as well, because that's where they were. You know, you had stories locally from the pagans in that area that kind of overlap with those thoughts. But it's the mountain at Caesarea Philippi where Jesus made his gates of Hades statement, you know, where he brings who do you say that I am? And it's, in my opinion, where Jesus is also transfigured. The traditional site is Mount Tabor, and there's I think there might be good reasons for that, to think that too. But it's not that near to Caesarea Philippi, and so we see like 6 days later that, you know, he brings them to a high place and on a high mountain, and he's transfigured there. I don't know if they would have traveled that far to Mount Tabor. They could have. But also, according to Josephus, at least, the top of Mount Tabor was walled and inhabited. And, you know, so it's, you know, getting in there, but also it describes them as all alone, you know, where they could be all alone with Jesus. And so there was some privacy there that's mentioned. And so it would seem to me that it would still be on Mount Hermon. Here's some mentions of Mount Hermon, like in Psalm 133, a song of ascents of David. This is like ascending Mount Zion, like when you're going to go to worship, right? How good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together as one, like fine oil on the head, running down upon the beard of Aaron, upon the collar of his robe, like dew of Hermon, coming down upon the mountains of Zion. There the Lord has decreed a blessing, life forevermore. So it's not just a singular Mount Zion, it's the mountains of Zion. So it's that God is now occupying a bunch of mountains, you know. But it's putting Hermon in a again in a positive light, as you know, like Hermon is part in worshiping God and not Baal. Psalm 68, it says, "Oh, mountain of God, mountain of Bashan." This could be Hermon. It could be another mountain that we're not really sure which mountain it is, but it's up in the north as well. It's called, "Oh, mountain of God, mountain top of Bashan." You guys remember, the bulls of Bashan surrounded me, in that psalm that's kind of describes Jesus, oh God, why have you forsaken me?" And he's quoting a psalm where they've sold my clothes for silver and all this kind of stuff. It's all descriptive of him on the cross. And he says, "The bulls of Bashan surround me." Bashan was associated with some of their enemies, including the giant clans. King Og of Bashan with the big 15-foot iron bed. That was where he's from. There was a bunch of demonic activity there from Bashan. And it is kind of like right in the area right there, I guess, where Mount Hermon is. So this could be referring to Mount Hermon. Mountain of Bashan, a many-peaked mountain, mountain of Bashan. Why do you look with hatred, O many-peaked mountain, at the mount that God desired for his abode? Yes, where God will dwell forever. The chariots are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them. Sinai is now in the sanctuary. So Sinai comes into this picture, mountain where, God decided he was going to make Sinai his mountain. You ascended on high, leaving a host of captives in your train and receiving gifts among men. This is about Christ's ascent, after he's been to Hades. Even among the rebellious, that the Lord may dwell there. So, Bashan is where the kingdom of Og is. Like I mentioned, it's the land of the Rephaim. Rephaim were related to the Nephilim. This is a giant clan. It was one of those clans that God wanted completely rid of. In fact, any of the clans that God completely wanted to get rid of had something to do with the giants. But we'll get to that story another time. Psalm 89. Let the heaven praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. I like that. Assembly of the holy ones. For who in the skies can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. It says, O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, with your faithfulness all around you. You rule the raging sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. Rahab is this seven-headed, dragon / sea serpent, but it's also the nickname for Egypt or Pharaoh. You crushed Rahab like a carcass. So this is referring to Egypt. You scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours. The earth also is yours. The world and all that is in it, you have founded them. The north and the south, you have created them. Tabor and Hermon joyously praise your name. So Tabor, again, is the traditional site of where Jesus was transfigured. And of course, Hermon is the mountain where he was at when he had his when he told his disciples about who do you say that I am? So let's talk about Caesarea Philippi, because if you look at where Caesarea Philippi is, this whole brown area here, this grayish area, that is Mount Hermon. So it's right there by Mount Hermon. And at the foot of the mountain there in Caesarea Philippi is a place called the Gates of Hades. In the Canaanite days, it was referred to as the Gates of Baal. And of course, I said Baal was associated not just with the mountaintop, but with the underworld. And so you have this whole, and there were different cults that had started like at different times throughout the centuries. But all these shrines all around here. Aaron went here, and I was hoping he could tell us a little bit about it. but there's all these kind of like temples, and there's all these myths surrounding it. Whether they came right to this place or not, it's just, you've got this rock, it's this big giant rock, on this rock I will build my church. So all of these images, is like there for Jesus to use as kind of like like having multiple meanings when he's having this conversation. So when you read Matthew 16, it says, "Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked the disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it.'" In other words, he is going to come down to the gates, and the gates are not going to withstand it. It's the same depiction when we say, "Open up your gates and let the King of Glory come in." It's a depiction of the gates of Hades being broken down, because at Jesus's crucifixion, he's him busting down the gates basically, and the underworld is in trouble. But of course, those being held captive are set free. And anyway, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Then he strictly charged his disciples not to tell anybody that he was the Christ. So, and he says a couple other things, and then right after that, after 6 days from this point on, from that last point on, it says Jesus took with him Peter and James and his John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah. It's interesting because both Moses and Elijah had been up and met with God on Mount Sinai, talking with him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah." He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved son, in whom I will please listen to him." So if we go back to this verse here, it says, "The north and the south, you have created him. Tabor and Hermon joyously praise your name." If we are talking about Jesus starting at Mount Hermon and then 6 days later going up on Mount Tabor, then you have possibly here kind of a depiction of Tabor and Hermon joyously praising God's name, because he is basically, that's Jesus is playing that out, basically, that he is the God of both of those mountains, So Moged, assembly, ecclesia, assembly, the church, all basically the same thing. Man's destiny has always been to be part of this divine council and to stand at the threshold of heaven and earth. He was placed on the mountain of God in Eden for the purpose to image God and to rule earth on his behalf. So man started off on the mountain assembly. The biblical story is the attempt of humans and their rebel gods to ascend the mountain and to make their own assembly, to become like God. You had that description there with the king of Babylon. We have this. We have the description of the pagan gods trying to ascend the Mount of Assembly. Of course, and they trying to become like God. And I say this ironically because they were already made in God's image. Adam and Eve were already made in God's image. Why would they want to be like God in any other way? You know, the humans ended up in slavery to sin and death and demonic rebels, but God restored man's destiny through Christ. And Jesus would build his own mohed, his own ecclesia, his own assembly on a mountain. We have a picture of this on the Sermon of the Mount, on the Mount. This is something that I picked up from the Bible Project website. It says Matthew portrays Jesus as the new Moses. So this is kind of a reenactment of Sinai, but with some key differences. So John the Baptist is portrayed as the last old covenant prophet, and now Jesus comes on the scene as the new covenant prophet. He is going to be, and again, when I mean prophet, we're not reducing Christ to a prophet, but he is part of the assembly. He's the human who's been in the assembly. So, the Samaritan woman recognized and said, "I see that you are a prophet." Jesus never denies that. So he is a prophet. Of course, he's a lot more. He's prophet, priest, and king. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain. So he goes to the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came with him. So in the Greek term, he went up on the mountain. So in the Septuagint, only occurs 3 times in the Septuagint. He went up on the mountain in those words, and it refers to Moses going up on Mount Sinai. So that term is something that in Greek you would associate with Moses going up on Mount Sinai. Jesus is portrayed as sitting down to teach. The Jewish interpreters, you don't see this directly, at least not in our translation, but there's a passage in Deuteronomy 9:9. I couldn't really make heads or tails of it, but they thought it meant that Moses sat down on the mountain. So there's something there that Jesus is kind of like, of course, if you were teaching, then you would take a seat anyway. But it's still another parallel that Matthew is drawing. Matthew connects the law and the Torah. So Jesus is making all these statements about the law. You heard it said, but I say. You heard it said, but I say. And so what Jesus is giving is a new covenant, and he's comparing it to the old covenant. And that's kind of what he's doing the whole time that he's given the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' sermon was in comparison and in contrast with what was delivered to Moses. Jesus delivered the sermon to an assembly that was sitting with him on the mountain. That's a key difference, because unlike Sinai, the people were not allowed up. It was only Moses that God would deal with. But now he is setting up a scenario where he has his followers as his assembly up there with him on the mountaintop. The Aaron and who else went up. They were only allowed halfway up, but the rest of the people, they weren't even allowed to touch the mountain. So, and he starts saying things like, he calls them a city on a hill that was a light to the world. So Israel was originally set up as a light to the nations, and it was going to be with Jerusalem and Zion was promised in prophecy as being the beacon of all nations. Now Jesus, what he was doing is he's identifying his followers as that Jerusalem and as that Zion. So when you go to the prophecies about how Jerusalem and Zion are going to be a beacon to the nations, the ultimate fulfillment of that would be Jesus and his followers as Jerusalem and as Zion. Here's an example, say in Isaiah 2. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. So you have nations flowing upstream, up a mountain, defying gravity, kind of. And many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his way, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their plows into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So this is talking about the new earth and the new earth scenario after God has judged the earth. But that mountain and the house of the Lord, Zion and Jerusalem, that is Jesus's followers, the mountain assembly. Of course, we have here in Hebrews 12, and we saw this last time, for you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and tempest, like in in Sinai, and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. For they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So here are my final thoughts about this. We're living in the period that Psalms 110 describes, where Jesus is sitting at the right hand of God, ruling in the midst of his enemies. So the enemies are still around, but he's ruling in the midst of them. They are still there, and we are at war, but this enemy has been defeated. All authority has been given to Jesus, and by extension to his followers. We are seated with Christ in heavenly places as his assembly on Mount Zion, much like the ancient pagans envisioned the assembly of their gods. Think of that. Paul would often reflect on these realities in his letters and then follow up with a therefore. And he'd go on to elaborate on what kind of lives we should then be living. What kind of lives should we then live, Of course, they are the kind of lives described by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mountain. To pray for your enemies and to do good to them. And, we are not just passive recipients of salvation. We are the embodiment of the one who sits enthroned over his hands and feet. He sits enthroned on Har Moed, the mountain of assembly. We are his imagers, sent out as priests and kings to transform the earth. And that's always been our job, to be imagers and hands and feet of God.